From Perk Ideas, licensed characters I want to come to the game, new game modes, new items, and more, here is my wish list for what I would like to ideally see in Dead by Daylight this year. I made one of these in 2024 and you guys seem to love it, so I'm making another one but with completely new ideas, so there are 50 plus more ideas in this video. Remember, all of these are just conceptual ideas to talk about for fun, without balance in mind, so it is okay for things to sound unbalanced in this video because that's not the point of the video. Alright, let's start off with some licensed chapters that I would love to see, and my first one has to be a Hollow Knight chapter. Hollow Knight is the only idea on here that's not necessarily horror adjacent, but I have so many good ideas for what a Hollow Knight chapter could look like that I think it would fit surprisingly well into DBD. The main killer I think would work really well is of course the Hollow Knight himself. The main reason I think this would work is because I could see this design being transferred well into DBD's art style, so it wouldn't look super weird. And there's so many different ability ideas that they could do based on the attacks that the Hollow Knight himself has, including stuff with the infection. Like they could have some sort of system similar to Nemesis where the longer the match goes on, or the more you do a specific thing, the more infected you get and the stronger you get. And I just think it would be so cool if you used an ability and the cooldown for that was him slashing himself. Like lore-wise, it would just be so awesome. I could also see characters like Widow or First Sinner being a killer. I don't think they would really look as great in the DBD art style, but I could see them having interesting powers with like Silk and with either the bells from Widow or maybe even the runes from First Sinner. Plus that attack where they go across the floor swinging their weapon could be something that actually works somewhat well in DBD. It'd be kind of similar to like Hillbilly's Chainsaw. The Last Judge would also be awesome. My only issue with this one is it's very similar to the Plague in terms of the way she looks, but I still think there's definitely potential there based on her attacks in the game, such as like being able to throw the ball and retract it. So maybe you can get hits by throwing the ball over a wall and then retracting it and then hitting them that way. That could be a super interesting ability that's really fun to play against. And then the one character that I think would work best in DBD's art style is Grandmother Silk. I can totally envision a more realistic looking version of GMS as a killer, and there's plenty of abilities that you could do with Silk, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be similar to the game. Like I'm sure they could come up with some unique stuff. Obviously for the Survivor, I don't think there would be a Survivor because it just doesn't really make sense, but I could see them doing kind of cosplay skins like they've done before. So they could have a character wearing like the Hornet mask with the red cloak, or even have like a Sherma skin or a Coral skin. Stuff like that would be kind of fun. And then for the map, I have a couple of ideas. One is Greymoor. I think Greymoor is like the perfect biome in terms of tonally fitting DBD. Plus it has crows. Like it just makes sense. But purely in terms of the atmosphere, having this kind of rainy, rundown area with like giant silos and windmills and stuff like that, I think personally would be really sick. My other idea is the City of Tears. This is another one where I think they could really stretch their creative muscles. There's so many different ways to design a map like the City of Tears, and just imagine if they had the City of Tears music somewhere as an Easter egg, kind of like how in RPD they have the save room music. That would be so sick. And then my last idea, if they could pull it off, would be awesome and would be a great nod to the games. For those of you that know Black Ops 3 Zombies, you know how on the Revelations map, they took a bunch of old maps and kind of meshed them into a single map and connected them pretty seamlessly? That'd be such a cool way to combine biomes from Hollow Knight so we can get multiple different biomes. Like if they just seamlessly connect to each other, you would get this map that has so many different looking areas and it would be really beautiful. All right, the next licensed chapter I'd want to see is Lethal Company. Now hear me out. You don't have to do the Survivor if you don't want to do the Employee because it's like not scary or whatever. But I do think the Bracken as a killer would be awesome because he could have some sort of stalking ability. And I just think that something kind of similar to his AI in Lethal Company would work well for DBD. And then for the map, it could literally be any of the moons, as long as it's kind of that design philosophy where 70% of it is outside and then like 30% of it is inside, or you could do half and half. But regardless, having the inside of the Lethal Company facilities would be really cool, especially because each little section could be its own tile, similar to how it works in Lethal. So the inside could be randomly generated in the exact same way that it is in Lethal. That'd be so cool. And it'd be really funny if they had certain items or like certain Easter eggs from the game. But I don't know if they could find a way to integrate some sort of enemy type in the inside area that has like an interesting counter, but also affects both the survivors and the killer. That could be a really unique gameplay thing that they've never done before. Okay, my next license idea is the Mortuary Assistant. Of course, the survivor would be Rebecca Owens. And then for the killer, of course, it has to be the Demon. And the reason I want the Demon so much is because he actually just looks terrifying. I could see this being one of the scariest killers in the game, especially if they design it in a way to make it scary. Like, you know how for the Unknown, they purposely designed it in a way so that there are sometimes jump scare moments with the teleporting? I think that they could focus on horror here and make it a truly scary chapter. And then the map, of course, would have to be the mortuary. They may have to take some artistic liberties because the map itself is kind of just like an L shape, but But you could have that outdoor parking lot area and then the mortuary as the indoor portion. And you could even have the basement and maybe just expand it a little bit. I feel like there's definitely some creative potential there. Now, before my next license idea, if you need something to significantly help your DBD performance and keep your gameplay super smooth while still looking incredible, you're watching the right video. I have a new partnership with Apex Gaming PCs to bring you a line of pre-built PCs that are designed to have an optimal DBD experience without the hassle of having to watch my 45-minute optimization guide. There are 3 builds: Haste, which is an affordable option for those newer to PC gaming or on a tighter budget; Endurance, which is perfect for those of you wanting a smooth performance without spending your entire life savings; and the final tier, Madness, the ultimate PC stacked with awesome specs like an RTX 5070 Ti and 32 gigs of RAM, which is designed to give you incredible performance at a reasonable price. If you're serious about PC gaming and want to stop having lag spikes while you play DBD, or if you want to stream DBD while still having high graphics settings, the Madness tier is the perfect option for you. And guess what? You can finance whichever PC you choose, so you only pay a small amount monthly rather than the full price up front if that works better for your situation. Go check out the link in the description or the pinned comment to see each of these builds, and make sure to use code KAITO during checkout to get 3% off your order. Thank you to Apex Gaming PCs for sponsoring this video. The next licensed chapter I have is The Substance. I am going to have spoilers for this movie here, so if it's something you're planning on watching, please skip ahead to the timestamp on screen. For The Survivor, I think it'd be really sick if we have another situation similar to The Troop, where it's one character, but you can swap skins to change characters. So for The Survivor, obviously it would be Sue and Elizabeth. So you'd be able to choose whether or not you want to use the younger version or the older version. And then for the killer, of course, it has to be Monstro Elissa Sue. I just think this would be so funny as a DBD killer, and there could be some crazy abilities using your little like blood hose thing. Could you imagine that in DBD? It'd be kind of similar to Plague in a way. Well, another ability that popped in my head for this killer for some reason is just the ability to do like a charge attack where she just sprints extremely fast until she hits a wall. And then if you hit survivors, you would like knock them down and deal a health state or something. So it would be very difficult to move in, kind of like Hillbilly's Chainsaw, but you would have to hit a wall to stop yourself. So it'd be great for traversal and long hallways, and it would have interesting counterplay from the survivor's perspective, because as long as they don't put a wall behind them, it's going to be very difficult for the killer to use their power. So I think it'd actually be quite an interesting ability. And then for the map, I don't know if this would work really well, but the only thing that came to mind would be to have just the top couple floors of the apartment building that she lives in. I'm really not a huge fan of indoor maps, so I don't know necessarily if a map would work for this chapter, especially because there's not that many locations in the movie itself. But who knows? Maybe they can figure out something interesting. And then the last licensed chapter idea I have on this list is a second part to Five Nights at Freddy's. Now hear me out. It would be great to have a second chapter, especially considering the success of the first one. So obviously for the Survivor, if we are doing a Survivor, I think it would be best to have either Mike Schmidt or Vanessa, and you could just have it be based on the movie since obviously they're not really in the games itself. Well, I guess Vanessa is technically in Security Breach, but I don't think it's the same Vanessa as the movie, so it gets a little confusing. Anyway, killer ideas. I have a bunch. The first one is Mangle. I think Mangle would be awesome, but I don't know how they would look in terms of like the animations of walking and stuff. I'm sure they could figure out something really cool, which would make them look super creepy, but I don't know. I love Mangle as a character, and I think they would fit really well in DBD if they're able to figure out some way to make them move in a creepy manner. And then Nightmare Foxy or Freddy would also be sick. I could see Nightmare Foxy being this like really quick, stealthy character, and I could see Nightmare Freddy having some sort of ability related to his frettles. I don't know what that could necessarily be, but maybe your goal is trying to like build up insanity in the survivors, kind of like Doctor, and then you have certain abilities to like confuse survivors or something. And then my other two ideas are some of my favorite characters in the entire series. The first one is Funtime Freddy. I just think this would be absolutely hilarious, especially if we got the same voice actor. I love his voice acting, and there could be some super interesting mechanics with Bonbon, like being able to send Bonbon out to do stuff, kind of like Houndmaster would be really funny, especially if he says the iconic lines like these.
Knock, knock, anybody home? Ready or not, here I come. Get ready for a surprise.
And lastly, what I think would be one of the coolest characters is Ballora. And the main reason for this is because her terror radius could just be her music. Like, how cool would that be? I would absolutely love to hear this iconic music every time I'm in her terror radius. And that is pretty much the main reason I'd want to see her as a killer. I don't exactly know what the powers could be, so if you have any ideas, feel free to put them in the comments below. And then for the map, it could be literally any of the main locations. I do think that sister location would probably have the best map because it's pretty big and wide open to allow for different different loops and stuff, so they can have some pretty good creative liberties there. And it'd be even cooler if they had the whole building where the secret entered room is to give additional play space, maybe as an Easter egg. Like, you know how in Nostromo you can get the key card and then open up the secret room? What if you could do that with the entered room to open up additional play space to get extra pallets or something on the map? All right, now I have a few killer power ideas. This is not necessarily characters, but just like the powers themselves. The first one I really want is a boomerang projectile. So think of it kind of like Houndmaster, where you can throw it to one point and then redirect it to another point, but instead you remain in first person and you fling it in one direction and can guide it with your cursor. And then after a certain threshold of distance is reached, then it just continues straight depending on where you aimed it. So if you've ever played Valorant, think of it kind of like a sky flash or something, but it's a projectile that injures survivors. I just think this would be a super sick power that's really fun to use because it has such a high skill ceiling, but also would be really fun to go against because there'd be so many mind games that you and the survivors could do with it. Plus, it's a very simple power and we need more simple powers in this game. My next idea is some sort of radioactivity based power. We don't have a single chapter that's kind of pushing into the radioactive horror, which I know is kind of overdone, especially in indie horror games, but I do feel like this is a realm that they haven't explored yet that has a ton of untapped creative potential. And then lastly, I want there to be an actual genuine jump scare killer. We technically have jump scare killers with like Hag, for example, or certain stealth killers like Ghostface, but these aren't real jump scares. Like, yes, they can startle you sometimes, but I want something where their power is to jump scare you. Like, I'm sure it's hard to think of a specific power to make jump scaring a part of the ability itself, but I don't know. I just want a really horror driven chapter with real jump scares because I just think it'd be so funny in terms of reactions. Okay, moving on to a couple perk ideas. I came up with a survivor perk and a killer perk for 4 different categories: gen progress, information, chase, and unique. So let's start with gen progress. And remember, the purpose of these is more for the concept and less so for the balance. Obviously, if these ideas were to ever come to the game, they would play test it and tweak them accordingly. But let's begin with the survivor perk for gen progress. When you unhook a survivor, the perk activates. For the next 60 seconds, if that survivor is in chase, every other survivor gains plus 15% gen progression for the duration of the perk. So this is essentially an anti-tunneling perk where if a survivor is getting chased right after being unhooked, then every other survivor is getting faster gen progression. I do think if this were to be in the game, the killer would need to have the little red perk icon showing that they're being affected by this perk, just so they know, which would further incentivize not chasing that person. But I also think this would be a really interesting risk versus reward perk if you want to be chased. Like, if you know that you're good in chase, you can try to take aggro from the killer to give your other survivors extra gen progression at the risk of you taking another hook state pretty quickly. And then my killer perk idea for gen regression is once you kick 2 generators, you bind them to each other and can see their progression based on the intensity of their aura. So similar to the new Vecna perk or the Eerie Wraith add-on. And then obviously if you kick another generator, it would just remove the first one. So you always have 2 generators bound to each other. And when bound, any progression that is made on one generator is lost on the other generator, albeit at a 50% reduced rate. Now, I think this is a super interesting regression perk that's never been done before, where the more a survivor progresses on one gen, the more the other gen regresses. So it's kind of like a mini version of Ruin, just on one specific generator of your choosing. However, if survivors work on both gens for X amount of time, let's say maybe 10 to 15% of the gen, then it removes the bind on the gens, so you have to kick it again to rebind them. I think this would be a great way to give some interactivity for the survivors, because whenever one survivor is working on a gen, they'd probably get a red perk icon showing this perk to show that the gen that they're working on is regressing another gen, so then they could infer where the other gen is and try to get a second survivor to work on it. Okay, moving on to information perks. For survivor, press the active ability button to initiate a handshake. Another survivor can join your handshake, which heals both of you simultaneously, albeit 35% slower, and reveals every single survivor's aura to each other. So this not only reveals every survivor's aura to each other so they can all find each other and reset, especially if you're on solo queue, but even though the heal speed is slower, you're technically healing faster because you're both healing simultaneously. I just think this is a really interesting reset perk, which will be especially helpful in endgame scenarios. And then for the killer information perk, whenever you injure a survivor by any means, you can see the aura of any survivor at least 40 meters away from you. But this perk does not work when downing survivors. I think this is a great perk to get general information on the whereabouts of survivors, but it can't be completely abused because they have to be so far away. This would be a great perk on, let's say, teleporting killers like Unknown, so you can have really good map pressure. But I do think there needs to be a caveat where survivors that are dead on hook do not have their auras revealed. I think that alone would make this perk idea a lot more healthy, because then killers can't use it to tunnel out a survivor. All right, moving on to chase perks. For survivor, whenever you become injured by any means, your next 2 fast vaults will be completely silent. So this is kind of a side grade to Quick and Quiet, where you do need to get injured to actually activate this perk. But rather than just having 1 fast vault silent, you get 2 completely silent fast vaults, which if you think about it, can be very strong because you can vault a window without the killer hearing you and then lose line of sight and vault into a locker. This would be a great getaway perk, especially if you pair it with things like Dance With Me and Lithe, but you just wouldn't be able to use it as often as Quick and Quiet because it requires you to get injured. And then for the Killer Chase perk, after reaching Bloodlust 1, this perk activates. The next time you enter a chase with the person you gained Bloodlust 1 on, you can press the active ability button to instantly increase a Bloodlust tier, and then this perk deactivates. This is a super interesting perk idea that'll mostly help M1 killers. I feel like we have an issue with a lot of perks where they help the better killers rather than the worse killers, but this perk, because it's Bloodlust, which usually gets lost on higher tier killers because you use your abilities, it would actually help the lower tier M1 killers in chase. But the fact that you have to get in Bloodlust 1 to even activate this perk to begin with means that it has enough of a prerequisite that I think it would be somewhat balanced. But I also have a different version of this perk, and I don't know which idea I like better. After reaching Bloodlust 1, the perk activates, same as normal. If you have line of sight of any survivor that's in your terror radius, so similar to the new Vecna gen regression perk, where if you have line of sight of a gen, it has that little arrow that pops up and then you can press the ability button to pop it. It'll be similar to that, but on a survivor. And you can press the active ability button to transfer your terror radius and red stain to them for 30 seconds. This would be a really awesome stealth perk that you can use to either switch chases and go to a different survivor or just a different place on your map in general, or you can use it to confuse the survivor that you placed it on because they won't be able to see your red stain and they won't be able to hear your terror radius, kind of similar to when you're facing a doctor with one of those add-ons. So I don't know, let me know which one you guys like better. And then lastly, for the unique category, for the survivor perk in this category, if you are on Death Hook and in chase, you gain 6% haste and your aura is revealed to all other survivors. But this perk deactivates when the killer has at least 6 hooks. So this is another anti-tunnel perk that just makes you harder to catch if you're on Death Hook if the killer hasn't yet reached 6 hooks. So this was kind of inspired by the anti-tunnel measures that Behavior was testing out, and I feel like it's a good concept because it gives you insurance that you're not going to get tunneled out early in the match, especially if your aura is revealed to all other survivors, so it's really easy for them to come take hits. But it deactivates when the killer has at least 6 hooks, so it wouldn't be that overpowered because as long as the killer isn't tunneling, then this perk basically has no effect. And then for the unique killer perk, this one is super interesting, and I don't know if it'd be good, so I'm really curious to know your thoughts. When you reach 6 hook states without sacrificing a survivor, this perk activates and 2 random dole totems get hexed. While both hexes are active, you see the auras of all healthy survivors at least 32 meters away from you, and you become undetectable until at least one of them gets cleansed. So this is a super high risk, high reward perk where not only do you have to get 6 hooks to activate it to begin with, but once you have it active, you get this really insane ability where you're fully undetectable and can see the auras of people far away from you until one of your totems gets cleansed. But because it spawns as 2 different totems, you can't just camp one of the totems. So I don't know, I feel like I could see a ton of synergy with this perk, and it'd be really cool to have essentially a permanent undetectable status on killers that you wouldn't normally get it on. Plus, a lot of people don't cleanse their plaything anyway, which is essentially the same effect, so it's kind of similar to that. One thing that might need to be added though is that the hex totems themselves also have a 32 meter radius where you cannot see the survivor's auras. Maybe not 32, that might be too big, maybe like 16 or something, but this would just prevent you from being able to see the auras of survivors that are working on your totems. But conceptually, I think it's an interesting idea. All right, moving on to a couple balancing changes that I would like to see. First off, we have 3 killers that I would like to see buffed, and let's start with the Hag. Hag is one of the least played killers in the game, and I think ever since they added the ability to wipe away her traps, she's just really not that good anymore. And I do think that wiping away the traps is a healthy change, but I feel like it makes the counterplay to this character so much less interesting because rather than deciding on whether or not you want to trigger a trap and have the potential of the Hag teleporting there, you can just go up to it and completely nullify it with no downside. So frankly, I wouldn't mind if they completely revert this change, and the only way to get rid of Hag traps is to actually trigger them, because I think that is the most interesting part of this killer. It's just a tug of war pulling her around the map and forcing her to spend time replacing her traps. But if we didn't go with this route, I wouldn't mind them just having an unlimited range for her teleporting. I think because survivors can wipe away the traps, if she's able to successfully have a trap that is hidden enough for a survivor to trigger it, I think she should be rewarded with the ability to teleport there no matter the range. But I would also like to see an anti-camp mechanic with the traps, similar to that of Vecna's. You know how Vecna's abilities are super slow if you're near a hooked survivor? I think we need to start adding that to other killers, and I think Hag is the perfect way to start because so many Hag players use use their traps near hooks. So maybe making it so that the teleporting takes way longer, which will give the survivors time to get an unhook, or just anything that makes the traps less effective when they're near hooks or near someone who is recently unhooked. I think that would be a great way to make this killer a little more healthy. The next killer I'd like to see buffed is the Death Slinger, and I only want a slight buff, and that is to have some sort of benefit for hitting long shots. Even if that's the Eerie add-on base kit, I really truly believe that hitting long shots should give you some sort of reward, because not only is it super risky, it is quite difficult to hit those shots to begin with. And as of now, a lot of the times it's just not even worth going for these shots. So I think having the Eerie add-on base kit, which is one where if you hit a long shot, you can insta down the survivor, I think that would be a great way to not only reward Death Slingers that are going for good shots, but also to incentivize Death Slingers to actually use their gun to go for cool shots instead of just zoning. So I think not only would it make it more fun to play as this killer and play against this killer, it would also make more Death Slingers play in an interesting way. And then the last killer I'd like to see slightly buffed is the Unknown. I think with Vecna coming out, you kind of realize how slow the cooldown is for Unknown's UVX compared to Vecna's power, which is essentially the same thing, but much easier to use and has a much shorter cooldown. So I really wouldn't mind seeing the Unknown's cooldown slightly decreased. And then for 3 killers, I would like to see nerfed. The first one has to be the Ghoul. I can't stand playing against this killer, but I think the only thing they truly need to nerf about this killer is when you cancel your power. I think the slowdown for canceling your power is way too generous for the killer, so it just becomes this really boring counterplay where the killer could just catch up to you instantly, cancel their power, and then you just don't have time to make it to a resource. So I really don't mind the fact that he can catch up to you, but I think the survivors need to have more time to be able to reach a resource. Like, it shouldn't be long enough to where there was no point in catching up to the survivor to begin with, but it should be just slightly longer to give the survivors a little bit more chance of getting away. The next killer I'd like to see a little tiny bit nerfed is Myers. And realistically, the only nerf that I'd want to see is super slight and just to make him a little bit more counterable. And that is, if a survivor has not been stalked at all yet, your power does not insta down. And I don't know if this would be a healthy change, so it's something I'd want to see as a test and have it be play tested, obviously. But the goal of this idea, which could be a completely different idea, but the goal of this idea is to prevent those situations where somebody else on your team gives Myers all of his stock progress, and then he just goes up to you and insta downs you when you basically had no counterplay because you didn't give him any stock yourself. So I essentially wanted to make it so that the killer has to stalk you at least a little bit to be able to use his power on you at all. Does that make sense? And the last killer I'd want to see nerfed, which is another very, very slight nerf, and that is Wesker. Now, I really enjoy playing against Wesker, except for one specific scenario, and that is the awful 50-50 of whether or not he's going to cancel his power or hold his power. I cannot stand these situations because a majority of the time, if the Wesker is good, he's going to win that 50-50. Because if you try to avoid his power, you're forced to be in a specific position behind a wall, which means you're not really making that much distance. So if he cancels his power, you don't have the distance to make it to a resource. But if he doesn't cancel his power and you try to make distance, he'll be able to round the corner and use his second dash. So in my opinion, this part of Wesker just feels really awful to play against. So I'd really love, just like Ghoul, if you cancel your power after one dash, then the slowdown is a bit more so that the survivor has more time to get away. Everything else about this killer I think is great. It's just that awful 50-50 zoning situation that's realistically more like an 80-20 in the killer's favor, I think needs to be nerfed a bit, especially with how many people play Wesker in this way. I've started to really dislike playing against Wesker for this specific reason because that's all that they do. For 3 killers I would like to see completely reworked. I genuinely think that these are killers that they have to completely scrap and rework from the ground up, and I think they just need to suck it up and just make the few people that play these killers angry with how they completely change the power. The 3 killers I'm going to talk about in this category I think are some of the most poorly designed killers in the game, to the point where I think we literally need to strip away all of their abilities and make a completely new one. And I don't necessarily have rework ideas for these, but I really think that they just need to go completely back to the drawing board and rework these killers from the ground up. So those 3 killers are Skull Merchant, Trickster, and the Twins. And generally, most people think that these are some of the most boring killers in the game. The one character I will say that I think would fit perfectly for a rework idea I have is the Trickster. I think the Trickster would work with that boomerang style ability that I talked about earlier so well. Like, he could literally just use his bat, and it makes sense as a trick because he's like spins his bat all the time. So it makes sense for him to be able to spin his bat and cause it to be able to like curve around corners and stuff. So I think that would be the perfect way to rework this character while still keeping him as a projectile based character, but having his power be a lot more interesting than just spamming knives. Plus, you could keep his main event ability and just make it so that the projectile speed is maybe faster or the cooldown is significantly reduced so you could throw it really frequently. I think that would be an awesome way to make Trickster a lot more interesting of a character and a lot more fun to play as and play against without having to make a completely new character. Let's move on to 5 killer perks I would like to see buffed. The first one is Whispers. I think Whispers is just completely outdated at this point since it's so old and hasn't really been changed. So I would like to add an additional effect to it because it is really cool. For those of you who don't know, the perk currently lights up if any survivor is within 32 meters of your location. So it's like decent, I guess, for information, but it's so situational and usually you don't actually really need it. So that's why I think it's kind of outdated. So here's the buff that I'd like to give it. After being active for 10 seconds, meaning there's been a survivor within 32 meters of your location for at least 10 seconds, Whispers locks on to the closest healthy or injured survivor for 60 seconds. And the reason I say healthy or injured survivor is because Whispers normally activates for people that are on the hook or downed too, but I wouldn't want it to be able to lock on to those people because it doesn't really make sense for this buff, and you'll see why in a second. So it locks on to the closest survivor for 60 seconds, and the perk icon will show you a directional indicator of the targeted survivor. So it gives you a better grasp of where the survivor is, and if you down the survivor within those 60 seconds of it being locked on, everybody outside of your terror radius screams, revealing their location. So kind of like a reverse infectious fright. So I think not only will it be a good information perk, especially for survivors that are being really stealthy, it can also give you even more information if you down that survivor within the 60 seconds. The next perk I'd like to see buffed is Unrelenting. Currently, Unrelenting only reduces the cooldown time of missed attacks by 30%, which is really not that good. Like it's pretty bad. The only time it's pretty much ever useful is when you use it in a loop to force the survivor to greet a pallet, which can give you enough time to catch up to them before they actually make it back to the pallet. And those situations are kind of what gave me inspiration for the buff. So whenever you miss a basic attack, this perk activates for 2 seconds. And if a survivor stuns you with a pallet within those 2 seconds, the pallet will instantly break and go on cooldown for 30 seconds. So I think this is a very cool perk to help those situations where you use Unrelenting to try to decrease the distance gap and try to take advantage of the survivor's greed. So if the survivor does actually throw the pallet on you when you miss your attack, then you basically have the overdrive ability of Singularity where it instantly breaks the pallet and slows you down just barely. So this will make it so survivors stop throwing pallets when you use your swing, which can help you actually catch up to them in some loops, making the perk actually valuable. The next perk is Territorial Imperative, which currently just shows you the aura of survivors that enter the basement, and it's so bad. So I'd like to give it a buff where any single time a healthy survivor enters your terror radius, you become undetectable for 10 seconds, and then it goes on cooldown for 30 seconds. So rather than, being territorial of the basement, you're instead territorial of your own territory. So it makes you undetectable for a bit whenever a survivor enters your territory, which means it's easier to hunt them down. But it only works on healthy survivors, which would hopefully balance it out a little bit. And of course, you could tweak the numbers and stuff. But I think the concept of becoming undetectable every time a survivor enters your terror radius is super cool and could be very, very useful on some killers, especially on killers like an insta-down like Bubba. Because then the survivors have to make the decision of, oh, do we heal to force him to use his ability, or do we stay injured so he never becomes undetectable? The next perk I want to see buffed is Shattered Hope. As of right now, it is completely useless because basically nobody uses boon perks. And Shattered Hope currently just makes it so that when you snuff a boon perk, it breaks instead of, just snuffing it. But I wanted to rework this, and this buff is super crazy, and I don't know if it'd be cool or not, but I really, really like the concept. So this is the buff. You can go up to any dole or blessed totem and kick it to shatter the totem. The first time you shatter a totem, it'll be rekindled into a random permanent boon totem. So the first time you ever shatter a totem, it'll actually become a random permanent boon totem for the survivors. So it helps the survivors. So you may be like, why would I want a perk that helps the survivors? Here's where it gets good. Each dole totem you shatter after that first one will turn into a random hex perk. And I just think this is so interesting. You have the downside of helping the survivors by giving them a random boon totem, right? But you then can have the possibility of getting multiple hex perks out of one single perk slot. And I just think that concept is really cool because it takes time for you to find these totems to set up the hex perks, because you have the downside of obviously getting the boon totem that's permanent, by the way, you can't break it, and you have to find the other dole totems to even get your hex perk set up in the first place. So it's a really high risk, high reward perk that can basically allow you to get more than 4 perks in a single game, since you can get multiple hex perks out of this single Shattered Hope perk slot. I think this would be really cool. And the last killer perk I'd want to see buffed is Human Greed. Currently, this perk lets you kick open chests to close them, and then the auras of any survivors that come within 8 meters of a closed chest are revealed to you for 5 seconds. Frankly, this is just garbage. This is awful. There are so many other aura ridding perks that are way easier to trigger, like I'm All Ears, for example. Plus, most maps only have 4 chests anyway, and some of the chests can spawn on top of a hill where the aura is barely going to do anything for you. So here's how I'd like this perk to work instead. It spawns the maximum number of chests in the trial, which yes, is technically a downside because it gives survivors more chests to work with, but it gives you more times where you'll see their aura. And also another ability I want to add onto this perk gains a token whenever you close a chest and activates immediately. At 1 token, so the first time you close a chest, you will gain a 10% faster vault speed, 10% faster kick speed, and 10% haste for 10 seconds. The next time you close a chest, when you gain 2 tokens, you'll have a 20% faster vault speed, 20% faster kick speed, and 10% haste for 10 seconds. So each token that you gain increases the vault speed and the kick speed by 10%, but the 10% haste and the 10 seconds of this ability remains the same, because obviously that would get really overpowered. I feel like it fits the human greed theme more because you're spawning the maximum number of chests with the goal of tempting survivors to use their greed to get items, but the more they greed with these chests, the stronger your ability becomes. So it's a really interesting risk-reward situation on both sides. All right, moving on to 5 killer perks that I would like to see nerfed. The first one is Surge. Surge has gotten on my nerves lately, but I don't think that it's overpowered, so I wouldn't want to nerf it too heavily. So the slight nerf that I have is any survivor that is working on an infected generator when Surge activates will prevent the generator from exploding, but the generator will start sparking for, let's say, like 15 seconds or 30 seconds or something. If a survivor leaves the gen or is interrupted from the gen while it's still exploding, then the gen will explode like normal and start regressing. Otherwise, it'll be unaffected. So it's kind of an interesting buff and a nerf to this perk. The nerf is obviously the fact that if you don't interrupt the survivor that's working on that gen, then it won't explode at all, so you won't get value out of that perk. But the buff is that if you do interrupt that survivor, then they leave and the gen starts to regress then. So normally if a survivor is working on a gen that gets surged, it'll pop for the 8 seconds, but then you don't get any value out of it actually regressing normally. So with this change, there's a chance that you don't get any value out of surging that gen, but if you spend the time to actually interrupt them, then the gen will explode and start regressing. I think this helps to make the perk a little bit more interesting and a little less mindless, and obviously the numbers could be tweaked to make it balanced depending on playtesting. The next killer perk I'd like to see nerfed is Nowhere to Hide, but again, I don't want it to be nerfed that heavily because I don't think it's that overpowered. So currently this perk shows you the auras of any survivor within 20 meters of your location when you kick a gen for 5 seconds. But the way I'd like to nerf this perk is rather than seeing the live auras of the survivors within those 24 meters, you instead get a snapshot of their aura when you kick to the gen, and it does not update live. So it doesn't change the effectiveness of the perk that much because you still see where the survivors initially were when you kick to the gen. But if they're moving, or if they saw that you kicked the gen and they know that you have Nowhere to Hide, they could start moving to maybe trick you into thinking that they ran in one direction, but then they were actually faking it out and they double backed in the other direction. So I think this would help to give survivors a little bit of counterplay to Nowhere to Hide without really making the perk less effective. The next perk I'd like to see nerfed is No Way Out. And again, I don't want this to be nerfed severely. This is the perk that blocks exit gates for a minute, assuming you hooked every survivor at least once, and it gives the killer a loud noise notification the first time a survivor touches a gate. So the thing that I would want to change about this perk is when there's only one survivor left, you will not receive a loud noise notification when they touch the exit gate, and it only blocks it for the default 12 seconds regardless of the number of tokens. I think this is just a perfect way to prevent those situations where there's only one survivor left and there's just literally nothing they can do purely because you have No Way Out on, because as soon as they touch a gate, you'll just go to that gate and find them. So this will still give them some sort of chance to fight in that endgame situation while still giving you some value because it does get blocked for 12 seconds. So if you're, traveling between the two gates, you'll see that they touched one of the gates. So it still will help you in the endgame situation even if there is one survivor left, but it at least gives that survivor a little bit of a fighting chance. The next perk I'd like to see slightly nerfed is I'm All Ears. And I do think that this perk is relatively balanced, but wow, using this perk on killers like Vecna has made me realize how strong it can be with certain killers. So that's why I'd like to nerf it just a little bit. This is the perk that reveals a survivor's aura for 8 seconds whenever they fast vault within a certain radius of you. And the only thing I'd like to change about this perk is that if the survivors are injured, then the aura is only revealed for half the time. So you'd only see them for 4 seconds instead of 8. I think this is a really simple way to maintain the strength of the perk while just slightly making it worse for survivors that are injured, so they have a little bit of a fighting chance. My other idea for a nerf to this perk is showing the survivor that they are being affected by I'm All Ears via a red perk icon on the bottom right. I think this could also be an interesting nerf because then it gives survivors the idea that you have this, so they can try to outplay you because they know that you see their aura. So I think it could make it a little bit more interesting because then the survivor and the killer are having mind games through walls, and mind games are the most fun part of DBD. So I think that could help make this perk a little bit more interesting. And for the last killer perk I'd like to nerf, that is Grim Embrace. Grim Embrace is just a really annoying perk if you're playing as Survivor. The gens getting blocked for 10 seconds, it just doesn't feel good to play against. If you don't know, whenever you hook a Survivor for the first time and you walk at least 16 meters away from them, it blocks every single generator on the map for 10 seconds. And then once you reach 4 tokens, meaning you've hooked every single Survivor at least once, it blocks every generator on the map for 40 seconds. So I would like to slightly change it to make it a little bit more healthy. So rather than this being completely a nerf, it's more of a side grade. The nerf is that it removes the gen blocking for 1 to 3 tokens, so that 10-second thing, that's just kind of annoying because it's just such a minor inconvenience that doesn't actually really help. But after you gain 4 stacks, you can gain another 4 stacks if you hook each unique Survivor, and then the gens will get blocked for 40 seconds again. But this perk deactivates if a Survivor is sacrificed. So I think this change would not only remove the annoying part of this perk with the really just annoying and inconvenient gen blocking for 10 seconds, but it would also encourage killers to actually go for 8 hooks without sacrificing a Survivor to be able to essentially double the effect of this perk. I think this is a great way to keep the perk in check, but simultaneously reward killers that are spreading their hooks evenly. All right, moving on to 5 Survivor perks I'd like to see buffed. The first one is Technician. Currently, Technician kind of doesn't really do anything. It reduces the audible range of your repair interaction by 8 meters, which really isn't that helpful. And then of course, the main attraction of this perk is that it completely eliminates the loud noise notification if the gen explodes. So realistically, the only time this perk is ever useful is for like the first 10 hours of playing this game when you don't know how to hit skill checks. So the buff I'd like to give it is while working on a generator, any Survivor working on that generator gains healing progress. And let's say like 50% progression of a generator is equivalent to 1 full heal. I think this would be a great way to actually make this perk a little bit useful because now you're getting an actual useful effect for working on generators. So this is great if you're injured and don't want to spend the time healing, or if you're not near anybody and you don't have a med kit, you're also able to heal yourself that way, even though it obviously takes a really long time. But if you're not pressured by the killer, it's a great way to both heal yourself and work on generators at the same time. The next perk I'd like to see buffed is Teamwork Throwdown. Currently, this perk makes it so that whenever you blind the killer by any means or you stun them with a pallet, it gives the endurance effect to all other injured survivors within 24 meters of your location for 10 seconds. This is like so bad. 24 meters is not a lot. There's so many prerequisites just to get 10 seconds of endurance for injured survivors only within 24 meters of you, mind you, which really isn't that big. And if you stun or blind the killer, that's already wasting like 3 of those 10 seconds probably. So by the time the killer actually catches up to one of the survivors that have the endurance, their endurance is probably going to be up anyway. So the only time this perk realistically is useful is if you're purposefully using endurance to take hits, but the killer could just wait out those 10 seconds. So I just think it's way too situational right now. So the way I would like to kind of change it, which I don't know if this would be healthy for the game, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So I'm first going to change it by only having it affect the closest survivor to you. So not every single survivor, but that survivor that gets affected with the endurance can A, see your aura if they're within those 24 meters of you, so they know that they're still in range, and B, as long as they stay within those 24 meters, they keep their endurance. And as soon as they leave the 24 meters, their endurance timer ticks down. I think this would be a great way to actually give it more utility and to make it more aligned with those teamwork perks where you have to stick close together to keep the effect. So although it wouldn't affect every single injured survivor in that radius, you'll be able to empower one other teammate, which could be very useful for a ton of situations, whether that be them taking a hit for you or allowing them to escape as long as you stay nearby to prevent tunneling. Like there's so many situations where I could see this being useful, but it still has the kind of annoying prerequisite of having to blind the killer or stun them and having to have the survivor within that radius for them to even get the effect. So I think that balances it out well. The next survivor perk I'd like to see buffed is Soul Guard. Right now what Soul Guard does is whenever you're healed or recover yourself from the dying state, you get endurance for 8 seconds. And if you're cursed by a hex, you're able to fully recover yourself from the dying state as though you have Unbreakable. And I don't think this perk is absolutely terrible, but I want to give it a little tiny bit of a buff to make it better against hard slugging. So within those 8 seconds after recovering from the dying state, if you heal somebody else from the dying state, then both of you get endurance for another 8 seconds. I feel like this is a really interesting way to counter those hard slugging situations. So if you're able to recover from the dying state and heal the other people within those 8 seconds, then both of you get the endurance. So I think it's a nice way to slightly buff this perk. But also, you know how whenever you're cursed by a hex, you're able to pick yourself up? I also want to add the prerequisites of being blessed by a totem. So if you're in the range of a boon totem, you can also pick yourself up, which can be really nice to not only get boon totems to be used more, but it also pairs really well with boon exponential, because then you're kind of making your own Unbreakable. And I'd also like to add the prerequisite of less than 50% of your bleed out timer. So if you're cursed by a hex within a boon totem's radius, or have less than 50% of your bleed out timer left, meaning you've been slugged on the ground a lot, then you're able to pick yourself up from the ground. I think these two changes of the extra prerequisites and being able to give the endurance status effect to other people that you pick up will be a great way to make this perk a little bit more useful. The next perk I'd like to see buffed is self-preservation, and this one is super simple. As of now, whenever another survivor within 16 meters of your location is hit by a basic or special attack, this perk activates for 10 seconds and it suppresses your grunts of pain, your pools of blood, and your scratch marks. So it basically makes you undetectable for 10 seconds. So it makes you really hard to track for 10 seconds, but I still just don't think that that's good enough for this perk, especially because most maps are outdoors. So it's really easy to see where you go anyway. So I'd also like to add the additional effect of giving you haste as well. And the number would depend on playtesting. So let's say it's 5% haste, just to give you that extra little bit of getting away power, because a majority of the time you're not going to be within 16 meters of a survivor when they get hit. And if you are, that means you're going out of your way to activate this perk. So I feel like you should be rewarded for it. And lastly, the final perk on this list that I'd love to see a buff for is self-care. Currently, this perk lets you heal yourself without a medkit, albeit at 35% speed, which is just so awful. And I think with the nerfs to medkits, I think we're at a point in time where we can buff self-care again to make it a little bit better. And here's my idea for the buff. Your self-healing speed depends on your hook states. So at no hooks, it's the standard 35%, but if you have one hook, it goes up to 50% speed. And if you're dead on hook, it goes up to 65% speed. I think this would make it just a lot more viable, because now if you're healing while you're dead on hook, it's way faster than the base self-care speed. And I think it's a fair balance to base the speed on the number of hooks that you have. So the perk is stronger depending on how risky it is for you to be sacrificed, essentially. But I don't think the speed is high enough to make it completely overpowered. All right, moving on to a few item and add-on ideas. The first one is a defibrillator, and the inspiration from this is from Arc Raiders, because I've been playing that way too much. But basically, it's a single-use item, but it instantly revives a player off of the ground and converts their recovery progress into healing progress. So it's kind of like using For the People, although of course it's a single-use item. But I really like the idea of the recovery progress getting converted into healing progress, because then rather than it just being a brainless item where you just instantly revive a person, there might be situations where you want to leave the survivor on the ground so that they can first recover, so that when you use your defib, they have a ton of healing progress, and then you can almost instantly heal them to full, which can really help in hard slugging situations. And I'm sure there's a ton of add-on ideas that you could come up with. Maybe you have some that give the survivor you use it on haste for a little bit, or endurance for a few seconds, so they can't get instantly downed again, stuff like that. But because it's single use, I feel like it's pretty balanced. Moving on to the next one, this is the firework trap, which can be placed anywhere on the ground, and whenever the killer comes within 4 meters of it, the firework will trigger, blinding the killer regardless of where they're looking. And the reason I say regardless of where they're looking is because it is a single-use item, so it's a great way to make an area much safer, because if the killer comes to that area, you have a little bit of a getaway. And there could be add-ons that either extend the blind duration, or maybe slow down the killer, or deafen the killer so they can't hear either, which would help if you're injured so they can't track you through the blind. I feel like there's a lot of cool ideas that could come with it, and I think it stylistically fit within DBD. And then the last item idea is the smoke trap, which is the exact same mechanics as the firework trap, except it releases smoke like the smoke bomb instead. And then the add-ons could increase the size of the smoke area, or the density of the smoke, just like the smoke bombs, or the duration of the smoke. There's a ton of stuff you could do with that, and I think having these traps would be really cool. Next up, we have a couple game mode ideas. The first one is Perk Guesser, which is a game mode based on my speed experiment video, which is almost at 1 million views, by the way, so thank you for that. There's a challenge I created in this experiment where one person is the survivor and one person is the killer, and you'd have to queue into this game mode as a duo because you're working together, and the rest of the players in the lobby are bots with the same exact perk loadout. And you have to test things out to try to identify the perks that the bots are using before the game ends, and if you guess the correct perks, then maybe you're rewarded accordingly with like blood points or eerie shards or something. This was a challenge that my contestants in that experiment really enjoyed, so I think the overall player base may enjoy it too. However, I do think if they were to do this, they would have to selectively choose perks that could be found, which is exactly what I did with the challenge, because there'd be some perks that are basically impossible for people to actually see or notice. But regardless, I think this would be a fun game mode to test your knowledge about DBD perks and to have kind of like a mystery that you're trying to solve, which is completely different than the normal gameplay loop of DBD. My next idea for a game mode is called Meta Escape, and when you queue into this mode, you have a specific rank, and you start the mode on rank 5, and you queue into other people of your same rank. So in rank 5, all players get a randomly selected meta build, and killers get a random killer at least B tier or above. If at least 3 survivors are sacrificed, then the killer wins and moves on to the next rank. Otherwise, the survivors move on to the next rank, and whichever side loses deranks. As you rank up, the random selections for perks, items, and add-ons get worse. So at rank 1, for example, at the highest rank, it'll end up being a randomly selected killer with a meme add-on against survivors with randomly selected bad perks. And winning in rank 1 gun, gives you rewards such as extra blood points or eerie shards. And this was kind of my way of adding gun game into this game. If you've ever played gun game in any first-person shooter, it's essentially where you start off with a bad weapon, and every time you get a kill, you switch to a better weapon. So you're trying to race to get through all of the weapons as fast as possible. So this was kind of my take on that for DBD, but in reverse, where you start off with a bunch of good stuff, but the better you do, the worse your loadout gets. So you're rewarded for winning with really bad stuff. And it kind of implements some randomness, which prevents people from just using the best killers possible all the time. My next game mode idea is called Endgame, where both sides start with no perks, items, or add-ons, and whenever the other side makes progress, you gain a perk, item, or add-on. So for example, if a generator is completed, the killer gains a randomly selected perk or add-on, and if a survivor is hooked, then the survivors gain a randomly selected perk, item, or add-on. I think this would be a great way to have a quote-unquote bare bones game mode without it just completely stripping away add-ons and perks, because those do make for more interesting situations. So it's kind of a bare bones game mode mixed with chaos shuffle, where the more you progress towards your objective, the stronger the other side gets. So I think it can make for some interesting situations. And the last game mode, which is super simple, it's just a 1v1 game mode with tournament rules. I've personally never really been a fan of 1v1s, but I do think having an integrated 1v1 game mode is not only a great way for people to practice chases on both sides, but it wouldn't cause these insane queue times because it's significantly less people, since you only need 2 people to fill a lobby. Okay, my last ideas are all quality of life changes and additions, and these are just things that I think are really important for the overall replayability or health of the game. The first one is a map offering that guarantees an indoor map or an outdoor map. I think this is a great way to bring map offerings back without making them still overpowered, because the best part about using map offerings back in the day was the fact that you could tailor it to your build. So for example, if you were doing Scratch Mirror Myers, you would bring yourself to like Larry's or something because you'd get a lot more value out of your Scratch Mirror build. So map offerings were fun because you could specifically use certain builds with them to synergize well. But obviously map offerings were abused quite a bit, especially by survivors. So I think having 2 offerings, one that guarantees an indoor map and one that guarantees an outdoor map, is the perfect middle ground between not being able to select a specific map, but still being able to select a specific style, so to speak. So with the Scratch Mirror Myers example, you could use the indoor map one to still be able to go to an indoor map, but it will be a randomly selected indoor map. Or if you're playing a killer like Hillbilly, you may want to go to an outdoor map so that you can actually use your power. I think this is a great idea, and I think is perfectly balanced, and I think would be really healthy overall for the game. The next idea is a Shrine of Secrets overhaul. I think it should be set up kind of like a Valorant shop, where you still have those random 4 perks that change every single day, where you can also get certain bundles of perks at a discounted rate. So for example, let's say there's like an exhaustion perk pack where it combines the expense of purchasing every single exhaustion perk in the Shrine of Secrets, but then discounts it by like 20 or 30% or something. So if you have the eerie shards to be able to buy a bundle, you can get all of those perks at a discounted rate and not have to wait for each individual one to show up. I think this would be a great way to make the Shrine of Secrets a little bit better, because right now it's just so outdated and so lacking. And then of course, having videos that show the perk being used would be really nice for new players. The next quality of life change I'd like to see is a way to prioritize rarities in the auto blood web spender. So if you wanted to just grind prestiges, then you can choose to prioritize lower tier items. But if you want to grind better items, you can choose to prioritize higher tier items, with the downside of leveling up slower. I don't think it would change the leveling speed that much, because it's not guaranteeing that you only get the tiers that you select, but having it as a preference so it prioritizes it would be kind of nice. The next thing I'd love is for them to remove perk tiers. I know this is said constantly, so I won't dwell on it too long, but there are just so many perks nowadays that the whole idea of perk tiers, which was to increase the grind, is completely redundant and unnecessary nowadays. And all it does is add more work for the devs too. So it would just be a win for everybody if they were removed, because they're realistically just a waste of space. The next thing I'd like to see is weather and daytime map variants. This would be a fantastic way to easily add what feels like more maps to the game. Even if you don't do weather variants, just having a dusk, dawn, and nighttime variant of each map would make them have a completely different vibe every time you go on that map, and probably wouldn't be that much additional work, because you'd just be relighting the maps and adding them to the map pool. If they did weather variants, it could be stuff like clear, rainy, stormy, or foggy, which I think would not only help in terms of variety, but would also help DBD feel a bit more like its roots in terms of tone and atmosphere. And it'd just be really cool to have this mix of the daytime variant with the mix of the weather variant. So you could have a foggy daytime map or a nighttime stormy map. It would just make it feel like there's more maps than there actually are. And another great way to do that, which would essentially double the amount of maps there are, is having mirrored maps. I did a video on this a while ago where I mirrored my screen, so I was basically playing backwards. It literally made Dead Dog look like a completely different map. So I think if they're able to implement a system where they can have mirrored maps, it would feel like there's so many more maps in the game than there actually are. Because like, look at this gameplay gameplay. Your muscle memory gets so screwed up that it's like learning a completely new map. The next thing I'd like to see is more offerings. I feel like there are so many more ideas that they could do with the offering system because it's hardly changed in the decade that this game has been out. So here are a few ideas. Chaos Vial, which loads you in with a random loadout, but doubles your blood point gain. I think this is a great way to kind of implement the Chaos Shuffle element into people's loadouts so they can do it essentially whenever they want. And obviously this would be for both killer and survivor. And it would also help to reduce the amount of killers and survivors that use meta builds. Maybe not by much, but it's still something. And then offerings that guarantee a specific daytime variant or weather variant if they decide to do that. That would obviously be cool. Offerings that give you or your team a slight buff at the beginning of the match might be kind of interesting. So for example, a survivor offering that hides the whole team's scratch marks for the first 20 seconds of the match, or a killer offering that hides your red stain for the first 20 seconds of the match, or maybe makes you undetectable for the first 20 seconds. Stuff like that to give you a slight edge at the beginning of the game. Luck offerings that actually increase the odds of items you get out of chests, or the amount of skill checks that you get, and then the killer version of this, which decreases those things, and maybe offerings that give you an in-game challenge for a small Eerie Shard reward. I just feel like we need more things that give you Eerie Shards because the Eerie Shard grind is so slow. So having something that lets you get more Eerie Shards would be really, really helpful, especially to decrease that new player gap so they can unlock more characters more frequently without having to spend money. The next quality of life change I'd like to see is debris decluttering. I feel like lately maps have just gotten so much debris and the hitboxes of the debris tend to be really bad. So it just kind of gets frustrating and annoying. And especially on loops, when they have certain debris on the sides of loop that you can get stuck on and lose momentum on both survivor and killer, it's really frustrating. So I'd love for them to go through these loops and just clean them up as best as possible to make them feel smoother to loop around. I would also like to see the killer and survivor swap buttons returned. I have no idea why they removed it, but I loved this feature, especially if you were, for example, looking for cakes that you had on certain characters. You could just keep pressing the next or previous button and it would stay on the same offering page. But now you have to go out of the loadout menu to the character menu, then select a character, then go back into the loadout menu, and then go back to the page where the cakes are on to even see if the cakes are there. I don't know why they removed this and I really want them to bring it back. I would also like to see a copy paste button for loadouts, which would be an amazing feature if you just want to take your favorite loadout from one character to the next, and a clear all button for the loadout would be a nice addition as well, although I don't really think that's as necessary. I'd also really like to have more variety incentives, just to incentivize people to not use meta stuff as much. I already had some of my best incentive ideas in the last version of this video, but I think encouraging players to use things they normally wouldn't is super, super healthy for the game. For example, we could have it so that 4 random killers get selected each day, and if you play those killers, you get double blood points by default or an increase in Eerie Shard gain. This would get people to play other killers that they don't normally play and would help decrease the disparity between the most commonly played killers and the least commonly played killers. I would also love to see more icons on the survivor HUD for solo queue players. So a couple of ideas could be an icon that shows if a survivor is running toward a hooked survivor. This would be phenomenal because then you could see if somebody is going for the save so you don't double up on the save, or you prevent those situations where nobody goes for the save. And I'd also love to see an icon that appears depending on the emote that you're performing so solo queue players can communicate with each other remotely. So let's say you want to tell somebody to try to find you, maybe for a reset, for example, you could do the wave emote and they will see it on their HUD. Or if you want to tell somebody else to go for a save, you could do the point emote and they will see it on their HUD. This would be a great way to add more communication for solo queue players without adding like a communication wheel or an emote wheel, which wouldn't really fit the art direction of this game. I would also love to see a filter to sort your characters by prestige number, which would just be a great way to see your progress in a clearer manner. I would love for the game to allow you to hover over perks while you're spectating someone to see what they do. This would be a great way for new players to learn perks, especially to learn the most useful perks, because usually those are the perks that survivors are going to be running. So it'd just be nice for them to be able to do that rather than having to leave the spectating menu to go back to the post-game summary to look at the perks. And lastly, I would love to see a rematch feature where at the end of the match, players have an option to vote to rematch. And if all 5 players vote to rematch, then they will load into a new lobby with the same players, and the killer will be allowed to switch killers if they want. And of course, everybody can adjust their loadouts if needed. This rematch system is just one of 26 ideas of how I would personally rework useless DBD features. So if you enjoyed this video, drop a like and subscribe, then come check out that video on screen. Or if you liked this video and want to see more ideas and concepts for DBD, check out my previous version of this video on screen. I even predicted a couple things in there, so it's an interesting watch.